One quick thing, just before we dive into the panel a little bit. So I've been here at Matter for about 3 years now, and I actually came from industry. And when I was in the biotherapeutic space, and when I first got here, I thought, boy, this digital stuff, this AI stuff, this is really hard. This technology is really complicated. There's some really, really smart people. And in healthcare, I think one of the things I've learned over the last 3 years is that, yes, it is very hard. Yes, there are a lot of smart people. One of the big challenges, and Dr. Jones alluded to this a little bit towards the end of his presentation, a lot of the things that our entrepreneurs in healthcare struggle with is the implementation side, is the commercialization side. Not because commercialization in and of itself is hard, which it is, but in healthcare, not a lot of folks think about the business process behind a lot of these technologies. I also came from the academic research side, so I fell in love with technology early on. Never thought about business process, never even knew what the word clinical integration meant. I thought, create a new technology and physicians will adopt it. Never really had a good understanding of regulatory and what that meant, and oh, there's somebody who's going to actually direct and tell me how I can use this and how I can't. So I always find it interesting now when we have panels and conversations like this to be thinking about the business process behind some of these tools. And I often do some guest lectures with some folks, students who are on the R&D side, who say, I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to be in the lab. I don't have to worry about commercialization. And one of the things I learned early on in industry was the smarter I was as a scientist about some of the commercial and the business aspects of technology, the more I could probably make an impact, especially on the industry side and certainly on a startup side. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. We talked about this session being sort of perspectives from across the value chain. And again, in healthcare, it's pharma, it's payers, it's health systems, it's providers. And so I think what you'll see up here is a great mix of those. And the scope of the conversation today up here is a little bit about how do we take these technologies that we've been hearing about this morning, and how do they scale? How do they grow? How do we make this sort of a streamlined process within our hospitals, within our health systems, within pharma, and from a payer side? How are these tools actually broadly implemented? I think we're still really early on in the process. A lot of these technologies are new. But I wanted to make sure that I hope you walk away from this panel at least with an understanding of what some of those barriers are, what some of the challenges are, and as you think about innovating and even developing new technologies and algorithms in this space, keep some of those things in mind, because these are ultimately your core customers that you're probably selling into. So with that, I wanted to ask each panelist to introduce themselves, just share some brief background and a little bit about what you do in your current role. And I've asked them to discuss or share with us who essentially their customer is, and what are the top 1 to 2 ways they see AI playing a role in terms of delivering value to their customers. What are 1 or 2 ways that excite them about that? So we'll get some perspective from them, and then we'll dive some more into the conversation. Lastly, and then I promise I'll shut up, I want this to be really engaged. I literally have probably 4 questions. So I'm counting on all of you to raise your hands and ask questions. Otherwise, we're going to be sitting here silently for a while. So please think of questions that you have. Nick in the back will have a microphone, and we'll circulate one around. Sound good? Everybody's good? All right. With that, Dr. Jones, I'm going to start at the end with you.
Sure. So my name's David Jones. I'm a cognitive and behavioral neurologist. That's my clinical hat, caring for patients with neurologic diseases of the mind and the brain. Think Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that. As a researcher, I'm a quantitative neuroimager. And within my healthcare institution, Mayo Clinic, I'm the director of artificial intelligence, helping us at Mayo kind of guide our vision around using AI to improve the care of our patients, and those are our customers, are my patients, And our goal is always the needs of our patients come first, and that's at the center of all of our decision making. And I hope to, I do see a lot of potential in AI to improve the care of my patients, and I really want to facilitate that as best I can, leverage this momentum that's out there right now in the healthcare field to properly leverage these technologies to improve the care of our patients.
Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Shapiro. I'm a principal AI engineer at Anthem, and I lead R&D effort to extend, to use AI to extend healthcare outside the provider's office. So essentially, the idea is to enable physicians reach out to patients when the patients are not in the office, and the other way around. So for patients to get care, for everybody to get care and to understand whether they need to, whether it's an answer to a simple question or whether there's a real need to go see a physician, and to be able to make that decision kind of informatively. My background initially it was in electrical engineering, and then I moved to neurophysiology, specifically control of human movement in healthy populations in patients with movement disorders. Did research at Sheila Ryan Ability Lab back then at Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. Then got involved in machine learning, and then moved to the industry and joined Anthem.
So hello everyone. Is this mic working?
Just close.
Okay, yeah, that's better, thank you. So Uma Makija, I'm with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, and I lead business development for digital health and technology. So for example, we recently announced a deal with Click Therapeutics for a digital therapeutic in major depressive disorder. That's something I was involved in. In terms of customers, I think being a pharma company, forefront is what's best for the patient. And we have, of course, a traditional pharma business in CNS and nephrology, but we are beginning to take a more holistic lens and thinking about healthcare solutions as a whole to meet patients where they are on their journey. And we think technology is going to be a big enabler of that. So in terms of our customers, patients, of course, but we also have to think about whether they're going to be reimbursed. So we have to think about payers and what their needs are. We also spend a lot of time thinking about providers and how they will adopt some of the technologies that we're thinking about bringing to market. So those are some of our customers. Regulatory is a big piece. It's important for the FDA to kind of understand and buy into, of course, what we want to bring to market. So in terms of my background, I have a bachelor's in molecular biology and biochemistry, but I've been on the commercial side of things on the pharma side throughout, as well as a stint in consulting. And at Otsuka, I transitioned to the digital strategy and BD team about 3 or 4 years ago, and I've been really focused on kind of building those capabilities internally. Very excited to be here today. Thank you.
I'm John Zalweta. I'm a psychiatrist and clinical informatics fellow at UIC. I do a lot of work with Alex Liao on digital phenotyping of psychiatric disorders. Then I also do a fair amount of work on more clinical operations efficiency, things like trying to predict who's going to show up for their appointment or not, or analyzing trends in referral patterns that we get to psychiatry. And in that sort of latter thing, I think our customer is, or my customer is really the clinician. And what I really want to do with that is that, unfortunately, like up till now, I feel like a lot of clinicians, if you ask them honestly how they feel about how technology is used for them, is that they do a lot of things for the technology. They spend a lot of time putting things into the EHR, and they don't really get a lot out of it. And that's where I think AI can make things easier for them, make it easier for them to take care of their patients, make it easier to do be more efficient with their work.
That's great. And we'll touch on that in a little bit. Let me start with this question. So we ask a lot about what's the role of AI, and if I just at a very 50,000-foot level, there's a role of digital and AI in terms of informing decision making, as basic as maybe coalescing, integrating data together. Down the spectrum, you see the role of AI actually being informative in terms of diagnostics. You can actually see technologies making diagnoses, and maybe even further down the road being more prognostic, right, relying very heavily on AI. And as you go down that spectrum, there's implications, right, in terms of regulatory, in terms of clinical. With your hats on, health system, payer, pharma, where do you think we are in that spectrum in terms of the role of AI in your current role? Is it more an input, or is it playing a central role in therapy and patient care? Mark, can I start with you?
So if you look at AI as a tool to detect patterns, then for us that can be used in any area where that pattern detection is complicated. Right? So first is analysis. Let's say analysis of medical records, and the problem there is not just that there is slow interoperability. So the sources of these medical records are different. Then to extract information from these records is non-trivial, in particular from non-structured part of medical record, and even from structured part. When you have the diagnosis, you have procedures that have been done. To get these patterns across millions of patients requires application of AI. To get clinically relevant information from doctor's notes from non-structural part requires application of NLP, so a subset of AI. This is just looking at what already exists, what the information is coming in. Our goal, though, is to extend that reach, the interaction between the provider and patients outside the office. And that means that, well, the data sources will be expanded dramatically. So you get sensors, you get text, you get users' behavior, whatever part of users' behavior they are willing to share. Now that potentially needs to be integrated with the clinical record. And that means that, well, now you can get into, from identifying patterns into individualized care, which is the target in the end.
So a lot of still collection, pattern recognition, that AI is playing more of a role there right now.
Yes.
David, from your standpoint, from a health system, from a patient standpoint, even from a physician use standpoint, what role is AI currently playing? Is it more collecting, organizing information, or is it actually moving the needle in terms of improving diagnosis and monitoring?
So it certainly has the potential to do that, and I think that's not far off. I mean, it's playing a role everywhere. There's a potential to play a role everywhere. And I'll use an example from our colleagues in cardiology. There's a relationship between the heart and the brain. There's cerebral vascular disease. So you can have an abnormal heartbeat, something like atrial fibrillation, which then a blood clot can form in your heart, and then it can go up and cause a stroke in your brain. And once somebody has atrial fibrillation, you want to know the right medication, the blood thinning agent to stop that from happening, but that exposes them to risk of increased bleeding. So there's a lot of management decisions about how to treat people with atrial fibrillation. What's the right thing to do? And our colleagues in cardiology are making great progress on using an ECG, measure of the heart, and actually using an AI algorithm on that. And you can see that somebody actually has normal sinus rhythm, so that it comes out normal. They don't have atrial fibrillation. But an AI that is very close to being rolled out will be able to say, this is normal, but next month it's going to be atrial fibrillation. So that's something that only AI can do at this point in time. And that's very close to being deployed. Once it is, then that'll open up interesting questions. That's a diagnosis, a new diagnosis, pre-atrial fibrillation, so kind of like pre-diabetes. what do you do for pre-diabetes? You know, you advise patients to do lifestyle correction. It does affect the way you treat them. So now if we have this new diagnosis of pre-atrial fibrillation, what's the management decision there? So you can actually then prove, well, this AI predicts atrial fibrillation, and the folks who have this type are the ones who actually should just start anticoagulation on them right now. That's possible. We haven't proven that. But you can see how once you start deploying AI to make predictions, it changes management and prognostication very quickly. So I don't think that there's this lag between it's only finding patterns and it's going to be a pattern finder. It'll do that, but as soon as pattern finders are deployed in the clinic, it's going to change the way we think about diseases, which is going to change management.
Just a quick follow-up to that. We talk a lot about technology and the role of technology. We don't often spend a time thinking about what role does that technology playing in terms of change in culture or shift in behaviors of the stakeholders that are using that technology. In a world where you see more prognostic technologies coming forward, AI playing a bigger role, do you think physicians will embrace that? Are they open to that? Or are they saying, you know what, I went to med school to solve problems, I don't want a computer doing that for me?
Well, I think that is a big barrier, and as we're thinking about deploying this tool, you know, we realize interpretability is a big part of that. And actually, when we consider this maybe when we're giving our readouts to our physicians, if they have some sense that they're understanding what's happening, they'll be more likely to adopt it, because then they realize that they can continue to pattern detect, which they want to do, so that they can innovate. And so in the readout, whatever they're using the readout for the algorithm, if there's some mechanism within that readout that will give them a sense of interpretability, the likelihood that they'll adopt it is higher, I think. We haven't proven that, but I think that's an important part of getting it to be adopted. But in the end, a lot of people will take the view that if it's an accurate prediction, it helps my patients, you know, they're going to do it. A lot of people have that view. Not everyone, but so I think at the end, people want to help the patients. So.
Uma, from your perspective, when you look at AI tools and the role of AI in terms of helping to collect, gather, analyze data versus being more prognostic, where do you see, especially in the industry as a whole, where is pharma today in terms of using these tools?
Yeah, that's it's a really great question, and I would say I think in pharma I think we still, at least at Otsuka, we still want to wait and see how things play out, and also kind of, you know, a lot of it is dependent on the type of data that's available and the type of data that's being processed that will eventually also be used to train your AIs. I think at this point, we see more in the clinical operations and clinical development arena versus really thinking about bringing anything to market. And that's just because there are so many things we need to figure out before doing that. I mean, for example, and Dr. Zuleta and I were just talking before this, you know, in the psychiatric domain, I think there was a hypothesis that maybe I could help with diagnosis in depression. When we did market research and spoke to a few folks, we found out that that's really not a need. And psychiatrists are quite comfortable with that. The need really lies in treatment prediction to either, because the trial and response, as we all know, with ADTs or what is pretty long. It's 6 to 8 weeks, and I think some. But for a tool to kind of come to market for something like that, it's the study for that. You know, how would you do a treatment response study? Who knows? So I think there are a lot of things we need to figure out before bringing some of these to market. So I think at this point, you know, there's a little bit of a wait and watch. I know some pharma companies are kind of experimenting a lot with AI for drug discovery. I think we're still yet to see anything substantial come out of that. So I think it's very early at this point. But you know, I think a lot of the research that's going on, hopefully over time, will get us there.
Yeah, I just want to sort of add to both of those last two comments on this question of whether physicians will adopt these technologies. I think some of it is intrinsic in terms of, like, some people are going to be early adopters, some people are really want to you know, jump on the latest whatever. But there's also, I think, a role for some sort of external forces, and I have a sort of anecdote about this with when I developed a model to predict whether people were going to show up for their appointments or not. I sent their predictions to the providers, and I thought, this is great. Of course they want to know this, but they didn't do anything with it. And then, like a few months later, there was sort of a rumor within the university that clinics that had high no-show rates, the university was going to mandate that you had to start double booking your appointments. And then people got interested, and then people started talking to me about, how can I use this? How does this model work? So.
Interesting. And in that process, we heard this morning Dr. Loeb talk a little bit about the value of AI, and Uma, you brought this up, is only as good as the data that you're putting into it. And we've heard that a lot, and we've had some conversations this morning about how strong are those data sets that we're looking at, how strong are those models that we're building. And this may be maybe too high level of a question, but to a layman to say, how good is the data that we're putting into these models today? And how do we know if it's strong enough and when it's strong enough to be able to say, okay, this algorithm is we're putting in enough good data. We've got the AI tool now that's going to help us be more diagnostic, help us be more prognostic. Is there an answer to that in terms of how do we know when the data is good enough and when the fidelity is strong and when it's robust enough? How do we know that? How do we judge that?
I think that's a difficult question to judge. I think that one of the important considerations with that data, right now a lot of people look at EHR data as sort of this vastly untapped source of potential, useful information that if we mine it, but sort of to the points that a lot of presenters have made today, if that wasn't what that data was originally designed to do, then there's a lot of things you need to consider. Things like, if you're looking at, for example, physician notes, where the physician notes, they carry the biases that each of us carries as physicians. And if you build an AI off of that, and then you could just magnify those and propagate them. So that's something that we need to, be considerate about, I think.
Mark, from that perspective of data sets and samples, a lot of people might look to an Anthem and say, wow, you've got X number of millions of members. Does that make it easier for you to either build those models or create those tools because you have a larger sample?
Both. It makes it easier, it makes it harder. Easier because if you have vast amount of data, as we do, then it's a bit more forgiving, just because lots of things are average out. Just following up on the previous point, the medical records to a large degree were designed not for clinical purposes, but for billing purposes. And very often when you look at unstructured doctor's notes, some of the information there is put to justify the accompanying claim. And so to extract again relevant clinical information is non-trivial. And then going forward, how do you know that you extracted actually what is clinically relevant? Now we need, unlike translation, for example, algorithms, when there is a score, there's a blue score, and then actually you can automatically evaluate the quality of the algorithm. In clinical extraction algorithms, you need input from experts. You need input from physicians. And they would look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense, or some doesn't make sense. So this is one part. Another part is that very often we don't start from scratch. So there exist algorithms and models that are very often rules-based, or maybe a little more simpler algorithms. And what we're trying to do, we're trying to improve them and make them quite a bit more selective and accurate and predictive and all that. And so then these existing algorithms and models serve as a benchmark. And so what you do is just, you work with the data, you build a model, you evaluate your results on their own, and then against the existing approaches. and then see what works.
Let me leapfrog off of that. There's two more sort of quote unquote hot topics that I want to touch on, and then want to open it up to the audience as well. So we talk a lot about, speaking of data, data sharing, right? One of the reasons Matter first came into existence was the fact that we said there was a premise in our thinking that bringing payers, bringing pharma, bringing health systems together, they each have a unique data set on a particular patient, right? So the idea in theory was that 1 + 1 + 1 could equal 10. We put these data sets together, we can learn so much more about these patients, build better profiles. These tools will help us understand that patient better and give us an opportunity in our respective industries to add value back to that patient. Data sharing has not been that easy, right? It's been very challenging. So question in the audience that might be is, why is that so difficult? What is making data sharing so challenging? And can you share some insights into that?
Starting here?
Sure.
No, I mean, I think that's a big topic, and there's a lot of reasons why data sharing is difficult. Privacy is a big part of it. I don't know if anyone has seen some of the latest algorithms that they're doing for the latest census, but essentially they're figuring out how many pieces of data they need from someone in order to identify an individual. It's not that many. It's not that many. And so for the census, they're actually trying to blur those data points a little bit, considering maybe we're going to blur those in the future to make reporting easier, less likely to identify an individual. So privacy is a big part of it. And that's a big concern for an institution like Mayo Clinic, protecting the privacy of our patients. Stewardship's a big part of that. And there, I'll point out something because we just published this, I think today or yesterday. There's some stories in the New York Times, and that's, you may be revealing the identity of your patients in a way you don't quite understand when you share your data. So MRI scans, right, that's of people's brains, doesn't just contain their brain, it contains their face, and you can reconstruct that face from the MRI data. And so that's, we can look at the New England Journal, like we just published this, and 85% accuracy, we can identify those patients based on their reconstructed MRI scan. So you may have convinced us all to share all that data and know it's all protected and all that, but there's a whole lot of faces out there right now and shared databases, which they're not protected. So that's a big issue with data sharing, is revealing protecting the privacy of our patients. So we have solutions for that, but so there's a way around that. You can deface the MRI, and it's going to affect your algorithms. So anyways, other considerations would be, stewardship of the data from Mayo's perspective, or is letting it go and then it being misused or not used properly, making sure it's taken care of properly. So good stewardship. But obviously we want data to be free. That's what we're doing in our institution right now. Part of my role as AI director is walking around freeing data from silos so that we can all use it. That's what we need to do to leverage it to help people. So we want to, we're motivated to. There's those challenges, there's technical challenges. How do we do that? Integrate it. The data formats aren't there for the sharing. Maybe for imaging data, DICOMs, it's fine. But how do we share polysomnogram data? What will you use that I'll use? That has time series data, different sampling frequencies, and there's annotations in it. There's video embedded in it. How can I what format should I share it? There's no standard. Those are a few. There's many other barriers. We'll talk about those.
Other thoughts from the panels, from the seat that you sit in, and from your industry perspective, what makes that difficult?
I think to flip it around a little bit, I think that besides the difficulties within releasing information, I think there's also challenges in deciding whether you should import data from a source. And for that, you need to know, is this data trustworthy? Is it, where did it come from? And that's not a trivial thing to address either. Like you don't want junk coming into your EHR either, and it potentially leading to problems. And
I have a comment, and I think it's also probably a question for the group here. There's always this question, at least, in terms of data monetization, and I don't know if that's a consideration. I personally think that it's more about the insights that come from the data, and if there are incentives around kind of making sure that you have protection for the insights or whatever that allow the data sharing, because without having that massive amount of data, you don't have the ability to generate the level of insights that you want to. So I don't know if that's a consideration. I don't know what the panel thinks, but sometimes we've struggled with that internally. It's obviously not, things like privacy, security, even the liability or stewardship, I think those are top of mind, but I don't know. I mean, data monetization is something like we've struggled with and don't have an answer to. So.
Are you, Mark, maybe not to put you on the spot, is monetization of data even on the radar screen, or are you still thinking about how do we pull the best insights from it?
So I would say that for us, monetization is indirect, in a way that if the data is being used so that health improves, insurance companies save money. So this is a win for everybody. Direct monetization, no. Moreover, maybe there are so many aspects of that. I don't know what to start. So with the existing data, so the data that we're getting from different sources, and we have it. To use that data, there is a personal identifiable data, and then there is a kind of non-PHIable, non-personal health information. With the data that can be aggregated and de-identified, that can be used for research internally, and actually we just made kind of an external data sandbox for research with millions of, so with records for millions of patients. It's not totally out there for free. It's curated in a sense that, well, people will have to request access, and that access will be given. But that's a very, very large repository of data available for outside research. Now, we follow up on David's point. Well, you don't have control. Once the data is released, you don't have control on how it is used and how the results are later on interpreted or misinterpreted or misrepresented. And anytime you start a conversation about data, well, Facebook is always in the back of the mind. So there are technological challenges of who controls the data, who controls access to the data, and how to enable various stakeholders of the data. Well, patients who presumably control the data, then physicians, then companies that aggregate it. How's the permission to use the data for what purposes is managed? And from the technology point of view, blockchain is one of the approaches that are being actively explored in the industry. Then there are regulatory aspects. Well, HIPAA and internal regulations and legal. So to use data for analysis, for research, even inside Anthem, we have to keep in mind that the results should benefit the members. And it's a fine line. So any basic research fundamentally down the line benefits people. But we need to take a little bit closer look and say, okay, well, if we do that analysis, then it can be operationalized, that can improve patient care. Okay, well, then it's much easier to share it with outside. Again, well, that's internal part. To share with outside, you probably need to go through quite a bit of I would say steps.
Yeah, more and more we're hearing from at a macro level, you know, the profile of a patient, the health profile of a patient is made up of clinical information, non-clinical information, social data type of information. There are so many pieces of data that need to be put together to make up this profile and understand patients from a population health perspective. So I'm hoping you all can sort of start to understand the challenge of even within one industry, within the payer side or within the pharma side, aggregating that data, understanding it is hard enough. Now imagine pairing it all together, tying it to a patient, and trying to make sense of it and pulling insights from it, and maybe at some point monetizing that. That's a long way to go for the industry. And so to that point, and my last question, and then please raise your hand if you have others. We talked a little bit about collaborations and what are the ways that companies like yours are coming together? What are ways that non-traditional healthcare companies are coming together? David, you mentioned in your presentation, you gave the example of Google. Can any of you talk a little bit about sort of collaborations that you've seen either between types of companies or different collaborations of different natures that you look to and you say, that's what's really going to move this space forward? Any thoughts or insights that you can share with the audience on that?
Maybe I can touch a little bit on that. So, I mean, one type of collaboration that we're increasingly seeing is pharma and tech, and pharma and software, not just startups, but also, we're also seeing big tech. For example, there was an announcement recently with Microsoft and I forget which big pharma, but one of the big pharma. Yes, Novartis, thank you. Yeah, Novartis is actually on the forefront of all of this, but that's definitely one type of collaboration, and there are, of course, challenges, challenges with that. Pharma is traditional, legacy, highly regulated, highly compliant, while a startup and tech a little bit more agile, nimble, usually even consumer-driven. So there's it's a tough marriage, but I think we're going to see more and more of it as we go forward. So that's just one example.
Any others?
I mean, as I've mentioned, I think collaboration is key to this whole endeavor. I mean, we need people from all sectors. I think you really need the folks with the domain knowledge about the data, the physicians collecting it, the ones who would deploy it, but also the researchers who understand that data need to be intimately involved with AI engineers, computer scientists, data scientists across industry in order to move this forward. I mean, it needs to be the people involved in this need to be able to work in teams, need to be able to collaborate, they need to be able to share and speak in different languages and learn someone else's language. At Mayo, we are trying to foster a culture of collaboration. We're actively trying to facilitate entrepreneurship in our physicians, actively seeking collaborators. We've brought in Google. We're very excited about that collaboration. They're going to be our cloud provider, but they're also going to start up an office in Rochester, Minnesota, and they're going to have engineers working there who will work side by side with physicians to help push these things forward. We want to partner with academia. We're building great relationships with UIUC. We look forward to continue to do that. And we have partners at Arizona State, and we're always looking for more. I think and we're not so interested in, we get approached by startups frequently of different types. They're not really interested in just say, here's our data, what are you going to give us back? We want you to collaborate. It's very collaborative, and so that we can protect patient privacy, we can be good stewards, we can also inform the way the data is being used to make the best models possible. So a true collaborative way to do this, and we're very interested in collaborating.
One last question, and I didn't actually prep the panel with this question, so it's putting them on the spot a little bit. You're in a room right now with innovators, entrepreneurs, researchers. There are folks undoubtedly in this room who are saying, I've got an algorithm. Mark, I'd like to talk to you. Uma, I'd like to talk to you. You're talking to these folks every day, and to give you all a sense of this, you all are being inundated with new technologies, new entrepreneurs, new solutions every day. People coming to you saying, I've got the next best thing that's going to help you. If I'm an entrepreneur and I'm coming to you, I'm an innovator coming to you, what are you looking for? How should I be talking to you? How should I be, in some sense, selling to you? What is that kind of conversation that's going to help me have that conversation with you about perhaps using my technology or implementing my tool? Any feedback or guidance that you can give to innovators in the room?
Yes, I think that well, the first suggestion: do your homework. Meaning that I would be really interested in knowing exactly what you're bringing to the table compared to what already exists. We will do our due diligence anyway, but it will be really a helpful and informative conversation if that startup, for example, say, okay, well, we have this great technology, we have this great new sensor algorithm, whatever, and we're looking at that particular patient population. That's how we want to improve that care. So now I would like to hear then how that particular innovation fits into the existing kind of set of technologies or approaches or algorithms. So this is the first part. And to understand exactly what it is. I understand that there are very often sales pitches and you're trying to get, well, behind all of that, what's the gist of it? Where's the kernel that can be developed and used and then in the end integrated into healthcare process. The other part is at the practical level, what's the business case? And I understand that it's hard very often to put some specific numbers, but at least some ideas that if you improve something, what do you think might be required? Because if this is a procedure that would require an FDA approval or getting a new code, it may take a couple of years. So that understanding should be there, that even if we like it as much as we like it, just to try it out and validate before scaling up, just to try it and validate takes quite a bit of time. So that understanding that it's a long-term process. At the same time, certain things can be tried out and scaled up relatively fast. And again, it's the question of positioning, and the better I am able to understand what exactly is being kind of developed, the easier it is.
Yeah, I would definitely, second all of that, and I would also say, just, and I know a part of their kind, there is a little bit of overselling, but we will do our due diligence. I think if there's a certain question that you don't have the answer to, or you feel, or if there's a BD person on the phone and you need to kind of get your technical folks, just say that. I think don't BS, sorry to use the word, but I think that's just be transparent, be honest about what your value proposition is, and if you don't have the answer to a question, we are open to that, and we are willing to kind of talk further. But I think that's really important, and also understanding where you are or how different you are from other competitors or other folks that are offering similar solutions. I think that's really key. So doing your homework is a big part of that. Otherwise, it just in the beginning, it really kind of SARs the conversation going forward, and we will do our due diligence and find out once we look under the hood. So I think just that's just a suggestion. Yeah.
And just from our perspective, I think one thing that we see with entrepreneurs, it's understanding your value proposition. And when we talked about the role of AI and the role that AI is playing, being honest about this is a tool. I have a tool that is going to help you aggregate that data or understand that data, versus I have a tool that's going to help you make a better diagnosis or be prognostic. And I think that's where we see a lot of challenges. We have a lot of ambitious entrepreneurs who say our tool can do everything, and it's more about thinking one step at a time. How do you prove it out, and how do you build it going forward? So That's just one other data point. Questions from the audience? This is your chance. Nick in the back's got a mic. Nick, we got one.
Just following up on this collaboration conversation, do you guys, so again, even if let's say there are multiple innovators who have a value proposition who can get to what you're saying, do you have a process in place to evaluate these innovations? Because if you're getting 100 of such pitches, how do you prioritize and how do you say, you know what, yeah, we'd like to talk to you, but give us a year? Or, because sometimes what I find is, it just gets stuck. Oh yeah, we like the idea, great. And next thing you know is 3 months later, you have a meeting and that meeting gets canceled. It's 6 months now, and the great idea turns into nothing. So what? I think this guidance will be helpful because I think this is where a lot of smaller companies struggle, that they can't get in, even if they have the best solution.
We actually do have a reasonably structured process that's being improved on what's called internally kind of sensing or intake, where there is a fast sort of triage done. And that means that the better you articulate what exactly you're bringing to the table, the better the chance that your point will be understood and properly kind of followed through. So that the less we need to guess, the better it is for everybody.
And I appreciate that because that's actually, I can see how that can be challenging because, you know, at least in pharma companies and also in, you know, traditionally Japanese pharma companies, the cycle can be really long. And I totally understand that. We do actually also have a quick screening and triage process, and it's exactly to what, I'm just kind of repeating what was said here is, I think articulating your value proposition and maybe even earlier on kind of being transparent about, you know, what your priorities are in terms of either partnering or collaborating. I think that would be helpful. But yeah, you know, we have a screening process. Sometimes it takes us longer because we internally are trying to figure out where the solution fits. I think that's also a big problem. So I think that also education and articulating the value proposition is useful. And you know, I think having a little bit of that patience is helpful. So appreciate that question.
Yeah, I will just add one point before we get to the next question, not to speak for our panelists, but just having worked with our health system partners, our pharma partners, especially in this space where digital AI is very new, keep in mind that they are learning along with you. And I will say this, I say again respectfully, there are many instances where I think our entrepreneurs are farther ahead than our industry partners. And so there's again, I don't say that disrespectfully, and that's why this partnership is really important. That's why it's important that they don't see you as a vendor and you just don't see them as a selling partner, but it is truly a collaboration where I think there's a knowledge gap and a knowledge sharing that's occurring between both sides. So I think the more you can develop those relationships too, to be able to say, here are things that we're learning. Here are things about the process that I think you can find helpful. They will see you as a trusted partner, and I think that could help the conversations as well. Jeff.
So Arun, first of all, congratulations on a great expert panel. I mean, I can think of some jokes. So you have a psychiatrist, a neurologist, an insurance guy, and somebody from pharma. And also congratulations for a great meeting. This has been really insightful. But the question I have for all the panelists, since we have this diversity up there, artificial intelligence can do many things. And at some point, you have some sort of predictive value, hopefully that you can validate, anywhere from 10% to 90 to 100% predictive value. And for each of what you do, whether it's seeing a patient, making a prediction of risk, what to pursue or not to pursue in the industry, what is your cutoff? In other words, we talked about atrial fibrillation and how many do you need to treat. In some certain studies, what we do for stroke, you may see a 5% benefit, which means that you would have to treat 20 people to get one patient benefit. And then what's the risk of that treatment? As opposed to something that would be 90% predictive value, where you treat 10 people with that drug and only one is the person who gets the treatment who should not get the treatment. But if that happens to be like brain surgery and you're pulling out that epileptic focus, say you have a 70% predictive value, do you want me to pull that out on 3 out of 10 patients? So can you each go down and say, what is your cutoff of when you say I've got this great algorithm because it gives me this predictive value for what I do?
I was going to say that I don't have a cutoff, but I have a framework to try to think about those kinds of things, and it involves thinking about what are the consequences of each of these potential interventions, but then also, probably even more importantly, what are the personal values and what is the patient's personal values, and how risk averse are they, or how much do they want to avoid a particular outcome? I think that all of that needs to be taken into consideration, and it's hard because a lot of people aren't very good about thinking about risk or how they would value their risk. And I think that's one of the things that we'll probably see more of as we see more of these technologies developed, is that I think we'll see more in the general population thinking about that kind of thing.
I think the question that you're really asking is how do you practice evidence-based medicine? I mean, we do that already, or we all have, we're doing it. We have a way of doing it. So I don't think it's unique to AI or ML. And I think the same framework that we're using for evidence-based medicine will apply in these circumstances.
So what is your cutoff? Evidence-based medicine.
No, I mean, it absolutely, just like EBM, depends on your circumstances. The way I use EBM, I certainly take into consideration my patient's understanding of the risks. You know, how risk averse they are will change my cutoffs. The PSA is always my go-to example.
The potential for harm of the treatment, I mean, it's something
Exactly.
the patient doesn't often fully
Exactly.
understand, and you as the physician, they're looking to you
Oh, so
to,
I will
to
tell
make
them
that
the risk
decision
of harm.
for what you recommend.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
really, the physician makes a recommendation, and they look to you as a physician to say. So you have to not put it on the patient to make that decision. I don't think that's fair. I don't do that to my patients.
Oh yeah, no, I give them a recommendation, but I take into account their understanding and their level of risk. I explain them the risk, and then give them my recommendation based on their understanding.
So what's your cutoff?
7.
Any other thoughts on that question? That's a difficult one to answer right now. All right.
Good, the mic's right here. My question is a follow-up to data and privacy. I'm curious about the expectations of both the end healthcare, users, as well as the regulators, in that the venue in which I'm sharing information as a patient is really changing. I go to a doctor's office and I have some certain expectation of privacy. But now, as on the panel here, we have Anthem that's rolling out apps to directly interface with the patients outside the office. My expectation of being on an app could be different in terms of privacy. Then we have John in Biofect, who is enlisting citizen scientists. So now they're deemed a scientist, with their expectation of privacy be different. So I'm just curious overall, how maybe expectations of privacy are evolving, and is there any movement at the regulator level, because it still seems to be a big bottleneck to deploying AI and really rolling it out more aggressively?
Yeah, I think that we talked a bit about all of the sort of protections that we have to set up to protect patient privacy, things like HIPAA laws and all of that. But then there's also, I think, increasing recognition about the value of sharing data. So in the latest, I forget, it's either the High-Tech Act or something, but they make it that so you'll get somehow punished. They haven't worked it out yet for blocking data sharing. For the institutions and individual physicians, that if they can prove that you're actively trying to prevent the sharing of data that should be shared properly, that you will somehow be punished for that. So I think that's a positive sign.
And there's some hints about this from the European Union. I mean, it's something that we're running into now at Mayo, as we're a global organization, in that the EU says you cannot use a patient's data for any purpose that it was not originally intended to be used for. And if you are found to violate that, there's a fine associated with that for each instance of that. The United States isn't doing that yet, and how that should change, and how exactly do we deal with that, or can you upfront ask these patients, this is what your data will be used for, or tell them explicitly, they opt in, opt out. So those are the types of, I think that's where the conversation's heading. But we're not there yet. What's happening in the EU is certainly a canary in the coal mine there.
Yeah, I can follow up on that. That there's a general recognition that GDPR actually stifles quite a bit of research in AI. There is an initiative now to develop AI standards by National Institute of Standards, and they solicited feedback, and so Anthem provided some ideas. Now, regarding the app, the expectations are the same as in the doctor's office. So that app is securely connected to the central. That's Anthem app, then that's to Anthem, and the information is treated exactly the same way as doctor's notes. And the overall, what's gives me hope that there's a general movement to make patients owners of their data, and to enable that, well, we need to have a mechanism in place to manage identity and rights to use the data, to give these rights, to revoke the rights if needed, and get some feedback on how it's being used. So it's being developed.
And I'll just add one point to that, and it's a great question in terms of more care is being delivered outside of the doctor's office. Privacy has been an issue. It's continuing to be an issue. We talked earlier about, from a collaboration standpoint, when you look at the FDA, they themselves are also looking at this very collaboratively. They're trying to learn and understand this as they go. Dr. Jones mentioned this before. They're soliciting input from us, the community, the pre-certification program. They're basically trying to learn this whole space of software as a medical device, software as a service. So they're actually looking to the community to learn a little bit more about how these things should be regulated. And so I'm sure that will be a part of that conversation. Any last question?
So before we were talking about, or you mentioned some advice about them being inundated with entrepreneurs. I was actually wanted to ask a question the other way around from each of your different perspectives. Let's say you have data and a particular problem that you feel has a value proposition from your end. What are the biggest logistical hurdles that you have to actually bringing that to a final solution and putting it to use in production?
And I think a lot of it is some of the stuff that we just talked about. A lot of that data is protected health information, which has a lot of protections and associated with it. So we can't just freely share it. I've seen increasingly people do things like de-identify it and then have hackathons and that type of thing. I think that's pretty cool. But otherwise, I think that's healthcare organizations have a lot of regulatory frameworks that restrict what we can share, and it can make it hard to have people validate their solutions.
Yeah, I think if you look at the kind of sequence, right? I think validation is definitely, we have a few initiatives going on internally where we have data, we are developing data, and even without having a use case in mind in terms of what this will eventually help with, I think that there are bigger questions around how do you process the data, do you have the right amount of data, how do you process it, the validation and all of that. So that's a big piece. And then in parallel, I think we're always thinking about what are we trying to solve for? Like, you have we have nephrology data, we have CNS data. There's so many things you can do with this data. You can use it for commercial insights, you can use it for drug development. And I think just kind of really thinking about what is it that you're trying to solve for, and amongst all the things that you're trying to solve for, where do you want to prioritize? So thinking about the use case and that, I think that's also a big piece that we need to kind of understand internally, strategically, to help us get there. And this probably has nothing to do with finding the right collaborator, what have you, but that's a big piece of it. So I think these are a couple of things that I can think of just on top of my head.
Yeah, I would say that for us it's probably not the question of sharing data, using data, but more of developing new sources. If you think about, well, healthcare, outside the office, you need new sources of data. That goes to sensors, whatever algorithms are used to include whatever information is out there. So following up though on the previous question, I would shout out to Matter because rather than applying cold and trying to make a page, well, if it's like with resume, like with anything else. Well, if you have some connections, that hugely helps. And the other way around. So we are trying to sense what's out there. And Matter or other incubators, well, it's a great framework where we need to get some sense of what exists in the ecosystem, because we're a part of that ecosystem. We support, say, research initiatives at universities, at Northwestern and UIC in the development on the East Coast and the West Coast. But that's the research at the universities. We're looking for startups that solve specific problems, and that means that interaction between clinicians and AI engineers and business people is paramount. So that, well, in the end, well, keeping in mind who the customer is, and the customer is a patient, and then the patient care is managed by the clinician, and then we're trying to solve a problem that would benefit either one or both of these. And that user interface and usability issue is a big one. So if you have some particular patients in mind, have in mind what that patient looks like and how that patient can use that app or that sensor. Is it feasible in everyday life, for example? Or with the physician, with the precious minutes that are left to care for patient or interaction after filling out EMR and all the documentation. Will that help them? Will that reduce the time that they distract from care? Just kind of general.
We're actually just got up on time. I want to say thank you to our panelists. This has been really interesting. I know Uma's got to catch a flight, so she might make a quick dash for the door. But thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking them for their time.